very inaccurate report that's been promulgated out there. As I said a short while ago, the army camp is fully functional and operational. This government, unlike that existed between 2010 and 2014, when a mass of people left this country, less than 200, under their authority, and went out to fight as foreign terrorist fighters, this government is working very hard with our international allies. Our national security services are fully
Senator Obika. Since we've started the procedure of the sitting today, I have had to get to my feet and constantly remind members of the standing order regarding silence. I'm not going to do it again. And that tone is going to carry for the rest of the sitting. There will be no more outbursts. Minister, have you finished your answer? Continue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, I don't know protection. I won't ask for protection. I think the country has seen the behavior of this immature senator. And the question continues.
Sit, 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 sit.
You cannot say that, sir. You have to joke. You cannot be for term sentences. No, totally. You can say privately. You can't say that here. You're not in Westmore.
The time for urgent questions is done. We'll move on now.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Mr. Vice President, the government is pleased to announce that it is in a position to answer all questions listed on the order paper.
Senator Mark.
This is a question for the Minister of Works and Transport, not the Minister of Finance. Question number 59 to the Honorable Minister of Works and Transport.
Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me as you are in charge here. The answer to question 59 is as follows. The Cabinet-appointed subcommittee made contact with a number of reputable international shipbrokers and charterers, ship owners and ship managers, and requested assistance from the governments of Australia, Canada, Italy, and Japan through their representatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Among the brokers, charterers, ship owners, and ship managers who were contacted were Golden Star Ferries Limited of Greece, the ESA Group of Italy, and Hornblower Marine Services of the USA. During this process, a proposal was received directly from Sealease Limited of Hong Kong for the purchase of an available new building fast ferry, then named the MV Doña Mercedes, a 700-passenger, 100-vehicle RoPax vessel, which was in its final stages of construction at the Bonifaire Development Shipyard in Nansha, China. The vessel was due for delivery to its previous client to complete the purchase. The answer to part 2 is as follows. This part of the question is not applicable because no fees were paid to anyone to search for or identify the vessel.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate the agent or broker, I think you refer to them rather as Sealease. Could the Honourable Minister share with this Parliament how or what were the circumstances that led to this particular company or broker having direct contact with the government to make this ship available? Could you indicate to us, for instance, how this came about? Because you did mention Creese as the broker involved in this matter.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. First, let me correct the record. I did not mention Creese as a broker. Creese Limited was, in fact, the owner of the vessel.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, the Honourable Minister indicated that a number of brokers were contacted by the interministerial team to locate this particular vessel. Could the Minister indicate whether IBS, International Broking Services, led by a fellow called Mr. John Atkenhead, was one of those brokers, and whether he's aware of that arrangement with the broker?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, I find this line of questioning very curious. But in order to assist Senator Mark for the umpteenth time, when ship brokers and ship managers make an international request to owners and agents for vessels, the information goes out into the market. And it was when these ship brokers made the request, Creese Limited became aware that the government of Trinidad and Tobago was in the market for a vessel, not this vessel. And this particular vessel was then proposed to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. With respect to the other statements and utterances of Senator Mark, all I would say is that, once again, those are figments of his imagination.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, would the Minister not agree with me that the Galleon Passage was a vessel that was old 1 year and about 4 months before he and the government got in contact with that vessel? And the real value should not be 17.4 million, but 8 million. Would you agree with me on that?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, for the umpteenth time, the sea trials for the vessel for the previous owner were conducted in September and October of 2017. The government made the decision to acquire the vessel in November 2017, 1 month after the sea trials were conducted for the previous owner. The sea trials are the final stage of construction of a vessel. First, you lay the keel, then you construct the hull, then you put on the superstructure, then you put in the engines, the gearboxes, the electronics, the navigation aids, the cabins, etc. And then when you are finished, you conduct sea trials. Sea trials were conducted for the previous owner in October 2017. So when we came upon the vessel, it was in fact 1 month after it had reached the end of its construction. The vessel also, we received a valuation of $19 million from one valuer and a valuation way in excess of $19 million from another internationally reputable valuer. The vessel is worth far more than the government paid for it. All of the things that Senator Mark have said are false, untrue, and figments of his imagination.
Senator Mark.
In this day and age of transparency, in this day and age of transparency, in this day and age of transparency and accountability, and having regard to the weak utterances expressed from the lips of this honorable gentleman, Mr. Vice President, may I ask the Honorable Minister whether he would be in agreement with my submission at this time, that in light of all that he has said, that we would want to suggest to him and the government that a criminal forensic inquiry be conducted into the procurement and acquisition of the galleon staff. Would you a criminal forensic inquiry into this matter?
Before I call on the Minister of Finance, I've noticed in the asking of questions a lot of inferences to characters and whatnot of individuals in the chamber. Please refrain, both in answering and in asking the questions, those inferences. It lowers the dignity of the process in the chamber. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In view of the fact that the government paid $17.3 million for the vessel, in view of the fact that the vessel was valued by 2 internationally reputable ship evaluators at values way in excess of $17.3 million, the only description I can give to Senator Mark's statements is that they fall within the realm of madness.
Senator Mark, next question.
Well, if I'm mad, I have a cousin. If I am mad, I have a cousin. Because he is more mad than me.
Senator Mark, just take a seat for a second. I don't know if it's the long Easter holidays or what it is today, but for some reason we can't seem to get through what is a regular, normal procedure for sittings of the Senate. I'm going to say it again. Please, let us not engage in these inferences into a person's character in this chamber. It lowers the dignity of the process and procedure. Senator Mark, continue.
I'm a fighter. I hope you understand that. And you see that in your channel. Good. No, I'm not threatening anybody. Mr. Vice President, may I go on to the next question? Question number 66 to, who is the Honorable Minister of National Security this time? Oh, the Honorable Minister of National Security. The Honorable Minister of National Security, acting.
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It should be noted that there are currently 2 pathologists on staff at the Forensic Sciences Center, namely Dr. Devines and Dr. McDonald Burris, who are conducting autopsies. With specific reference to the question, upon receipt of official correspondence from Dr. Alexandrov of his resignation, the Ministry of National Security in December of 2017 advertised the position of pathologist. Only 1 application was received, but the applicant has not yet completed his program of study and therefore cannot be employed at this time. Accordingly, the ministry is currently in discussions with the United Nations Development Program, United Nations volunteers, with respect to the sourcing of an additional forensic pathologist to augment the pathology staff at the Forensic Sciences Center. This approach was used previously to source Dr. Alexandrov. Further, in an effort to alleviate the workload at the center, the Ministry of National Security has commenced discussions with the Ministry of Health with respect to that ministry, that is the Ministry of Health, treating with the non-forensic pathology. At present, most bodies are sent to the Forensic Sciences Center by the district medical officer, regardless of the cause of death.
Mark. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, could the Honorable Minister, Acting National Security Minister, share with us what is the complement of staff required on, or put it another way, sir, how many pathologists are needed at the level of the forensic center, or how many are on the establishment of the, that is the question I'm trying to get.
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I don't have that information. The question asked was addressing the shortage of the pathologists there, which I've answered. I'm sure the Honourable Senator, if he puts that question, can be answered in the appropriate time.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether there is a period that the government is examining as it relates to getting volunteers within the UN system to come and work at the Forensic Center? Is there a time frame for it?
I wouldn't allow that question. It doesn't arise, Senator Mark. Next question.
He said that there's... Anyway, I would know. Mr. Vice President, he also raised the question about advertisements, that only one person applied. Would the Minister not agree that there's need for us to engage in some re-advertising given the state of affairs at the Forensic Center at this time?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, this area of pathology, there are a limited number of qualified persons in Trinidad and Tobago. The advertisement went out. They got one application, not even by someone who had completed their qualification. We are now engaging an international body that is quite an expert and hopefully someone that would be able to provide us with assistance in this area. If a need for re-advertisement takes place in the future, I'm sure that the ministry will do so. But at this stage, they engage in a system with a process that normally produces a result of qualified pathologists.
Senator Mark.
In light of the shortage of personnel in that particular field, would the minister or would the government not want to examine the possibility of issuing scholarships to citizens of this country with a view to embarking on this program of pathology over a period of time? Would the minister want to respond to that particular invitation?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, this government, upon assuming office in September 2015, before, I think it was December 2015, had actually done exactly that. We looked at what areas were necessary in the planning of Trinidad and Tobago going forward, and we've appropriately meshed our scholarship offers with what we think are the developmental needs of Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, that had not been done for the period prior, and pathology is one of those areas that we are offering scholarships for.
Senator Mark, next question.
Thank you, sir. To the Honorable Minister of Education. Question number 67.
Honorable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the administration of schools in Tobago is under the purview of the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, Tobago House of Assembly. The Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, who also has responsibility for education in Tobago, has commissioned a committee to devise a policy to deal with the issue of bullying in schools. In the interim, Mr. Vice President, the following measures are being undertaken by the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy to address this issue. 1. A number of preventative programs, including conflict resolution, communication skills, and problem solving, are provided by guidance officers to help students better understand themselves and others, how to respond to conflict and solve problems non-violently. The programs are offered at both primary and secondary schools. 2. School social workers drive the responsive approach to bullying through counseling of students with behavioral problems and programs such as anger management, have also engaged the parent-teachers associations to sensitize parents on the issues of bullying. 3. The system of supervision involving key personnel in schools has been enhanced to minimize the incidence of bullying. Systems have also been put in place to ensure that safety starts at the school gate with the establishment of proper protocols for anyone entering the school compound and the use of specific strategies to mitigate against the likelihood of bullying. Teachers and heads of departments have been trained in areas such as classroom management, conflict resolution, and problem-solving skills to better treat with student behavior. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether he's aware of the membership of the committee that the Chief Secretary has established, the terms of reference? Well, I shouldn't go on because you may say I'm going to another question. So I'm asking him, the Honourable Minister, that is, whether he's aware of the composition of the committee that was established by the distinguished and Honourable Chief Secretary, who is in charge of education.
Minister of Education.
Mr. Vice President, at this point, I am not aware, and that information can be provided as soon as possible.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, Mr. Vice President, could the Honourable Minister also help us in the provision of information as it relates to the terms of reference of this committee and whether there's a timeline for submitting this report, because bullying is a very serious matter in Tobago.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, the second part of Senator Mark's assertion that bullying is a very serious problem in Tobago, I take issue with that. However, with respect to the first part of his question, we will be in contact with the Chief Secretary and we'll ask him to provide us with that information, the information that he has requested. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
I have to indicate through the Honourable Vice President whether we could get that information within 1 week, sir.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Vice President, at this stage, I'm unable to make such a commitment. As I said before, we will have to get in contact with the Chief Secretary, who will provide that information. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate the measures that he has outlined as interim measures to address this scourge and plague that is disturbing schools in Tobago, whether there has been any positive outcomes in terms of results with the implementation of the various measures that you outline as interim measures? Would you want to share with us based on your communication with the THA?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Vice President, I'm very happy to state that as in Trinidad, so too in Tobago, we have seen a decline in the incidence of indiscipline and violence in our schools. And this principally is because of these measures that have been put in place in schools in Trinidad and also in schools in Tobago. Thank you.
No, that's all. Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, sir. To question number 68 to the Honourable Minister of Education.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Again, thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. The Ministry of Education is fully aware of the financial challenges being faced by the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, and every effort has been and will continue to be made to ensure that its obligations to the campus and the University of the West Indies as a whole are met in a timely manner. The Ministry of Education is in active discussions with the Ministry of Finance to source the necessary funding for the university. As of March 31st, 2018, the University of the West Indies had received approximately 43% of the allocation for fiscal 2018. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, could the Honourable Minister indicate how the poor or tardy releases of funds from the Ministry of Finance, how would those developments be impacting on the output of the university? In other words, Mr. Vice President, the ministry in its releases are very slow. What impact this approach, the slow releases of funds to the university, is having on the University of the West Indies output in terms of its
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Vice President, as we are all aware, in my previous capacity, I functioned as a teacher for a number of years. And one of the things I always guarded our students, particularly students in sixth form, was against circumlocution. Senator Mark has been going about a roundabout way in asking questions. Let me first state, Mr. Vice President, that the Ministry of Finance has not been tardy in its releases to the University of the West Indies. I have stated in my answer to the question that as of March 31st, 43% of the allocation for fiscal 28 has been made, has been disbursed to the University of the West Indies, and therefore I see no merit in the question that has been asked. Thank you.
Just hold on for a second. Again, let me just remind the inferences to the characters of the members in answering questions and in asking questions. Please refrain from doing that. It causes a response, and again, it causes disturbance in the House when you do that. So just answer the questions to all ministers who have to answer questions on the order paper, and to the askers of the questions, supplementary or otherwise, just ask your supplementary questions without stating your opinion on how the question is asked or otherwise. Senator Mark, supplementary question.
Yeah, I was about to deliver TKO, but I have been advised, so I will not go there. Mr. Vice President, may I ask the Honorable Minister whether he could share with us what are some of the key challenges facing the University of the West Indies as a result of financial difficulties via releases.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Vice President, I am at pains to state that we have been meeting our financial obligations. We, in this House, debated the budget in which there was an allocation to the University of the West Indies. We have been meeting those commitments, and let me repeat for another time that up to the 31st of March 2018, 43% of the allocation has been disbursed to the University of the West Indies. And therefore, I do not see any grave challenge of the university in meeting its commitments.
Next question, Senator Mark.
No, I think I have two.
You have supplementary?
Yeah. No, I'm cool.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Senator Obika.
Thank you. Question, Mr. Vice President, question number 69 to the Minister of Trade and Industry.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Firstly, it is not accurate to say that the Point Fortin Business Park is vacant. While there are no buildings on the site yet, the tenanting of the park is well advanced. The park encompasses 11 half-acre lots.
Continue, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you. The park encompasses 11 half-acre lots of developed land space aimed at facilitating light industrial and manufacturing activities. The Evolving Technologies and Enterprise Development Company Limited, known as ETEC, received the completion certificate from the Point Fortin Borough Corporation for the park in August 2017. To date, all 11 plots are tenanted, with parties in possession of letters of offer which have been accepted. 8 of the tenants have executed their memoranda of lease, with that of the remaining 3 tenants still to be executed. In keeping with the respective lease contracts, all tenants have a 3-year period from the date of execution of the lease between both parties to obtain approvals from the relevant statutory bodies and complete construction of the respective facility. Part 2 of the question. ETEC, on behalf of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and by extension the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, is actively following up with each tenant to ensure that the 3-year construction time is maintained. Thank you.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Could the Honourable Minister indicate how much rent or leases, in terms of how much revenue by way of rent or lease, was received to date regarding this said park?
Minister of Trade and Industry.
I'd be happy to provide that information at another time.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Can the Honourable Minister indicate when were the leases effected?
Minister of Trade and Industry.
But as I said, 8 memoranda have been executed. I don't have the dates on which they were executed with me, and that information can be provided.
Senator Obika.
Mr. Vice President, very important to this would be because businesses in Point Fortin have spoken to me, indicating they need space in the park. Who are the parties that have received these contracts? Could the Minister inform the Senate?
Minister of Trade and Industry.
I don't have the names of the tenants with me, but if you had perhaps given a detailed question, I would respond to you accordingly.
Senator Obika.
Mr. Vice President, my last question on this matter, I guess I would have to bring the question, we'll come again with this question in a different form, but my last question is, as the government now feel they have failed on the tech park because they claim they will create 245 jobs in November 2015, and they have created none on the park.
Just, Senator Obika, ask the question again because I didn't quite understand the question that you're asking. Succinctly ask the question.
Could the Honourable Minister inform the Senate and the Parliament if indeed with regard to this park they have failed in the provision of jobs?
I won't allow that question, Senator Obika. That's the end of supplemental questions. Next question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the willingness of the government to answer question number 70 to the Minister of Sport and question number 71 to the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs posed by my colleague Senator Roach is much appreciated, but I seek the indulgence of this Honourable House to have the answers deferred until Senator Roach returns to the Senate. Thank you very much.
Questions number 70 and 71 will be so deferred until Senator Roach returns to the House.
Mr. Vice President, may I seek your indulgence on the written section of the order paper in the appendix? There are some outstanding matters, particularly question number 13. I know that the Honourable Minister had said he had made a statement at the last sitting. I don't know, for instance, through you, if you could update us on this particular matter, sir.
In relation to your inquiry, Senator Mark, the reasons for the delay has been received and it is being attended to by the President of the Senate currently.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
The debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the Senate adjourned on Tuesday, March the 20th, 2018, will be resumed. A bill entitled An Act to Make Provision for the Maintenance of Public Safety and Order through Discouraging Membership of Criminal Gangs and the Suppression of Criminal Gang Activity and for other related matters. Those who spoke on that day were the Honourable Faris Alwari, MP, Attorney General, mover of the bill, Senator Gerald Ramdeen, Senator Mahabir, Senator Jennifer Batiste Primus, Senator Amin, Senator Ian Roach, Senator David Small, Senator Foster Cummins, Senator Tahaka Obika, Senator Torel Shriki-Soon, Senator Melissa Ramki-Soon, and Senator the Honourable Clarence Rambrat, Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, and finally Senator Paul Richards. Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me to contribute to this debate on the Anti-Gang Bill number 4 of 2018, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, it is no secret to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that crime is the #1 issue that is affecting our society. Mr. Vice President, for over 15 years, we have seen remarkable levels in the increase of crime, serious crimes, and that successive governments have tried in order to suppress criminality and the murder rates in the country, but some has failed and some has been successful in their attempt. And I say that during the period of 2010 to 2015, the People's Partnership government led by the Honorable Leader of the Opposition now, has been able to reduce crimes to the lowest level in over 33 years, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, that trend continues into 2018, as we have seen over 130 murders occurred so far from period January 2018 till present date, Mr. Vice President. January of this year has been dubbed as the bloodiest murder in the history of our country, accounting for over 59 of those murders. And Mr. Vice President, it cannot be business as usual in Trinidad and Tobago, because our people are dying, our young people are dying especially. We have now been forced to put ourselves in self-imposed jails, Mr. Vice President. Nowhere is safe. And that place you regard as your castle, which is your home, is not even safe anymore, because the criminals are coming into your homes and killing you, Mr. Vice President. And criminality, gang activity, murders, they affect every single society of our country. It causes a breakdown in the families, it causes a breakdown in the communities, and it destroys our youth. It is a destruction of the social fabric of this country. It is a cancer on this country, Mr. Vice President. Gang activity and murders. It affects our economy, because we have seen very recently that the United States of America, Canada, and the United Kingdom, they have issued travel advisories warning their citizens from coming to Trinidad and Tobago. This has a very debilitating effect on our economy in terms of tourism, Mr. Vice President. As we have seen for the past 2 years since the PNM has been in government, it has had the lowest amount of tourist arrival in Trinidad and Tobago. And Mr. Vice President, something has to be done. That this anti-gang bill alone is not the cure-all for the crime in this country. We need a holistic fight against crime. We need to target primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. We need to target the primary persons who are now becoming or being budding criminals in this country. Then, the secondary aspect, we attack the criminals themselves. We either try to rehabilitate them, or either we try to punish them for whatever wrongs that they have committed. And the tertiary fight is that of rehabilitation after they have been convicted of various offenses. So when we look at this bill, being a mere 19 pages, 19 clauses and 2 schedules, it has very serious measures, Mr. Vice President, dire consequences, and it gives the police extensive and extraordinary powers. And this is the reason why when this bill was brought in another place at another time, in 2010, a sunset clause was included. And the reason for that sunset clause is that it will ensure accountability and check and balances on the extraordinary powers of the police. And for the listening public, what is the sunset clause? It is basically a clause that was inserted in the bill so that when the act is proclaimed and assented to, it would only be enforced for that period of time as prescribed by the sunset clause. And when that period has expired, the act is no longer of any force. So we must look at what happened in December of 2017 when this bill was brought back in another place, Mr. Vice President. Simply what the opposition leader at the time was doing was actually ensuring accountability and checks and balances on the extraordinary powers being given to the police. And that is why at the time we could not have supported the bill, because we thought that the police should be made to account for the powers that have been given to them. But we are here today, Mr. Vice President. All of us who have debated in this, on this bill so far, we have to be grateful for the intervention of the opposition leader. Because had it been not for her experience and her expertise in this area, we would not have been here. The Attorney General and Minister Robinson Regis would have indicated that the bill could not have been brought back in this session. But the opposition leader, she read the standing orders and saw that we could have suspended the standing orders in order to resume debate on this bill. And for that, we thank her. And Mr. Vice President, when we look at the several clauses of this bill, I would say that although we on this side support the bill, it is not a perfect bill, and there's always room for improvement. We on this side, our belief is that we should strengthen the legislation. And the Law Association would have made various comments regarding the circularity of certain clauses of the bill in terms of the offenses being in the schedule of the bill and also being substantive offenses forming part of the bill. But there's one offense I want to look at, and I would regard this as one of the simplest offenses in the bill, and that deals with clause 6 of the bill. And it reads, Mr. Vice President, at section 6, a person who is A, a gang leader, B, is a gang member, or C, professes to be a gang leader or a gang member, in order to gain a benefit, intimidate other persons, or promote a gang, commits an offense. So simply, we are criminalizing the offense of actually being in a gang membership. But now the difficulty lies when we examine this properly on how we are going to prosecute this crime. Because let's take, for example, a person who is a gang member commits an offense. Now we have to look at what a gang member is. So when we look at section 4 of the bill, clause 4 of the bill that deals with the definition of a gang member, it states that it is a person who belongs to a gang or associates himself with gang-related activity. So now we have to go and find out what is a gang. And the gang means a combination of 2 or more persons, whether formally or informally organized or engaged in gang-related activity. And now we have to go and find out what is gang-related activity in the bill. So it shows the complexity of prosecuting these types of offenses. And then when you look at the gang-related activities, it would be the offenses as set out in the second schedule of the bill, I believe. So it shows the difficulty that the police would actually have, or the DPP's office, in prosecuting these crimes. Because far too often, the crimes that are present in the schedule of the bill, for example, kidnapping, murder, the police are unable to properly investigate these types of offenses, and therefore they fail in the courts. So now we have to give them additional work in order to actually prove the gang offenses in addition to those traditional offenses that find themselves in the schedule. When I looked at the Kenyan legislation, Mr. Vice President, it seemed to simplify this issue in terms of the complexity of defining a gang member. All it says is that a person who belongs to a gang is a gang member, and all it did was actually define what a gang is. But they use the terms organized criminal groups. One suggestion I would like to also make to the Attorney General, I see he's here in the chamber, is that when we look at the Kenyan legislation, there's actually a provision where the minister, on the advice of the Commissioner of Police, can actually declare organized criminal groups. So this may actually assist the police when prosecuting gang membership. And Mr. Vice President, if I may read the provision in the Kenyan legislation to the Attorney General, it says where the minister has reasonable grounds to believe that a specified group is engaged in any organized criminal activity under Section 3 of this Act, he may, on the advice of the Commissioner of Police, by notice, declare that specified group an organized criminal group for the purposes of this Act. So what you're actually doing is now you're actually putting notice into the public of who the gangs are, so that they will now know not to associate themselves with these individuals. And this makes it much easier to prove gang membership, because once you can show that the police associates with this declared gang, then they commit an offense. So I would ask the Attorney General to look at that. And there's also a check and balance on this provision in the Kenyan legislation, that any person who has been aggrieved or they believe that they are not an organized criminal group, they can in fact apply to the High Court in order to challenge that decision of the minister. And this type of clause finds itself in other legislations that we are also dealing with. Another clause that I want to look closely at is clause 16 of the bill, which actually deals with the detention provisions of the legislation. And section 16 of the bill gives the police extensive powers, and it may be very draconian also, because once a person is detained, even without a warrant, they can be detained by the police for a period of up to 72 hours, Mr. Vice President. And then if the police wants to continue the detention, they apply to the High Court and they can get a period up to 14 days. So we can keep a person in the police station for up to 14 days without charge, Mr. Vice President. That is the extensive powers that are actually being given to the police through this legislation. And I want to say this, and I want to put it on record, that far too often, the police, what they do is pick up the boys from the corner with no evidence, put them in the station, and then they decide to gather evidence against them. That is not how it is done, Mr. Vice President. What the police actually has to do is do their work before they actually detain or arrest any individual. And especially for offenses such as these, being gang-related activities and gang membership, the police has a right, or they should, do their duty in order to conduct proper surveillance of these gangs so that they can know who are the members of the gang and whether or not these persons are actually involved in the gang-related activities, Mr. Vice President. So I say that giving the police these powers, they now actually have to perform the checks and balances on themselves so that they would do their work before they actually arrest someone. Now, when we look at the first schedule of the bill, it provides for an offense, Mr. Vice President, with respect to Section 9, the possession of bulletproof vest. Now, when I looked at the 2010 legislation, a definition was actually given for a bulletproof vest. I see in this 2018 bill that was laid that definition was actually removed, Mr. Vice President. So I asked the Attorney General in his winding up for the reason for the removal of the definition. Also, I want to ask the Attorney General, when I looked at the Firearms Act, there's an offense for the manufacture of guns and firearms. And I think that that would actually be something that we can look at in terms of including it in the schedule, because we have seen in this country where criminals are now very innovative, that they create their own guns, because we see many homemade guns are actually being manufactured by certain criminal elements in this country. So I asked the Attorney General if you can look at that in terms of inserting the manufacture of guns as an offense listed in the schedule. And also, under the Prevention of Crime Act, the Offenses Weapons Act, we can probably look at including this also in terms of opening up the types of weapons that gangs use, because they are very dynamic in terms of how they operate. So the inclusion of the Prevention of Crimes Offensive Weapons Act can actually open it up so that we can include non-traditional types of weapons, because there have been reports where gangs are now using grenades and high military weapons, Mr. Vice President. Also, I saw at clause 16 of the bill, subsection 3, to be more precise, that they spoke of the custody record, and I know that the Attorney General would have circulated some amendments regarding this, and this would have also been an issue that was raised by the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago regarding the custody record. I see that the amendment is now to include the station diary, but I think that this amendment is actually odious, because when you look at Standing Order 17 of the police standing orders, they actually have a duty to record any person that they detain in the station diary. So it's basically reiterating what the police standing orders actually say. So I don't think that this amendment is of any moment. However, I would say that the police service should now move from actually putting handwritten entries into a station diary and into a more modern system where they actually put the information into a system so that every police station in the division or the country could access that information, because it would now be easier to target, pinpoint, and actually make the connections with all these gangs that operate in our country. And those are the issues so far that I had picked out when I looked at the bill, Mr. Vice President. So now, once the bill is passed and it goes into law, we must now examine how it is actually going to be operationalized. Because this bill actually touches and concerns every single aspect of the criminal justice system, which is made up of the police, which is in charge of the investigation and prosecution. It is made up of the courts, which is responsible for adjudicating on these matters, and also the prisons, which is responsible for rehabilitating these persons who have been convicted. And we must look closely at the type of evidence that the police is required to gather for this type of offense in order to get a successful prosecution. And there's a Court of Appeal judgment which is very instructive on this point. It is Civil Appeal P-162 of 2015, the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago against Kevin Stewart. It's a very famous judgment, please, Mr. Vice President. And it actually dealt with the issues of unlawful arrest and false imprisonment. And if you would allow me to quote from the judgment, Justice of Appeal Barrow, he stated that it is readily apparent from these provisions, when he was examining the anti-gang legislation, that proving gang membership in a court of law is no slam dunk. It requires a careful compilation of the evidence showing how the gang is organized, how the gang activity is perpetrated through gang members, and their respective roles in such activity. Evidence at trial must be carefully led to show the nexus between the gang member, and the activity. In a case where the gang-related activity to narcotics, evidence of actual sales of the narcotics is required to prove the gang-related activity. He says that mere surveillance without more may not suffice. It is not simply to observe the accused making interactions with other persons. He went on to say this undercover detection may be necessary. The best evidence would no doubt be that of a former member of the gang who has direct knowledge of its activities. And when we look at his judgment, Mr. Vice President, what the court was actually examining there is one of the lowest standards in criminal law, which is that of whether or not the arrest was actually lawful. So if the police is unable to satisfy the court at this level, it's going to be very difficult for them to prove a charge beyond reasonable doubt. And one line that struck out to me from Justice Barrow's judgment is that he said that the best evidence would be former members of the gang who has actual knowledge of the activities of the gang. But what have we done so far in this country to grant incentives to these gang members to come forward to actually give evidence? Nothing has been done. What about our witness protection program for persons who are in the gang or out of the gang who wants to give evidence? Can we sufficiently protect them? Mr. Vice President, I know Senator Ramdeen would have raised several issues regarding the witness protection program, but we must strengthen the witness protection program in order for this legislation to actually be implemented properly and operationalized. Because as Justice Barrow said, the best evidence would be a live witness in the box. Mere surveillance is simply not enough. So we must, in order to actually see any success in this legislation, get the groundwork right before we even move forward. And the United States, they actually have one of the best witness protection programs, where the witnesses are actually put under 24-hour surveillance, they're relocated, and in some instances, they actually change their identities. And the reason why our witness protection program in this country would have difficulty in working is because of how expensive it is to maintain any witness. And criminal trials in this country take almost 10 years before it reaches the court. So are we going to have to maintain a witness for over 10 years? If we fix that problem, shorter trials, speedier trial, then that in itself would actually assist us in putting these persons through the witness protection program. And that is one aspect of it in terms of how we are actually going to prosecute crimes under this legislation. But Mr. Vice President, it had one issue that really touched my heart deeply, and that is the matter that is currently before the court. And I'm aware of the standing orders, and this is an issue that is in the public domain. It is the prosecution of the accused persons in the murder of Dana Sitahal, Senior Counsel, former Senator of this Parliament. And Mr. Vice President, this issue touches me very deeply because Ms. Sitahal, I would have completed my 10 weeks in service training with her at her chambers, El Dorado Chambers. She would have also coached me in the International Criminal Law Moot Competition. And I'm sure that every single citizen, when they heard of her execution, that chills ran down their spine. The nation went into mourning when Senior Counsel Sitahal was executed. And Mr. Vice President, you know what happened in that matter? There was a blunder in that prosecution. I would read from a... Yes. Yes, I am going to quote Mr. Vice President.
No. I would caution you not to go down that road in relation to an ongoing matter or case that is in the courts as it is right now. Could you move on to another point, please?
Mr. Vice President, all I will simply say is that that part of the matter is completed. I have an article I will quote from it.
It's still in the courts as it is right now. Could you move on from that? Not go down the road of that point. Could you move on, please?
And, Mr. Vice President, we would have seen that in certain instances where the police would not have laid the charge properly. So in cases, we see that elementary issues such as laying the charge properly, because in the criminal justice system, you have two offenses. You have a summary offense, you have an indictable offense. A summary offense is laid through a complaint, an indictable offense is laid through an information, which is laid in the magistrate court. In cases like these, we see that they lay a summary charge on the wrong form, which is the information. What happened is that accused persons will now have to be discharged because they simply laid the charge wrong. So how are we going to properly prosecute these offenses if we cannot get the basics right? So, Mr. Vice President, this would lead to many persons actually being discharged from the courts in terms of laying charges properly under this legislation. And I also want to look at what the DPP had to say about this matter, Mr. Vice President. In a Trinidad Guardian article published on Monday, November 7th of 2011, it is entitled, "Cops Get Tongue Lashing from DPP." And DPP Roger Gaspard, Senior Counsel, he would have said that the enforcement authorities must ensure, 1, proper preparation by law enforcement agencies, 2, cooperation rather than competition among law enforcement agencies. And I pause it, Mr. Vice President, to say that there's experience in this country where the police within the service, they don't share information between themselves. And this actually causes a problem in prosecuting crimes in this country. It doesn't make sense that the police gather all this evidence, but Central keep their intelligence and Port of Spain keep their intelligence. There is no information sharing. They operate in silos, Mr. Vice President, and I think there needs to be some sort of bridging of that gap in order to encourage some cohesiveness between the law enforcement agencies in this country. The DPP also said that there must be proper and current police documentation of gang affiliation and activity, the developing of gang databases, the employment of informants and the development of an informant policy, a close study of gang dynamics and group criminal behavior, a proper appreciation of accessorial liability as it pertains to gangs, the development of a gang unit, and I think that one has already been completed, and effective surveillance strategies, and most importantly, gang experts who are thoroughly conversant with gang dynamics. So those are the comments by the Director of Public Prosecutions, that while he had issues with the bill, he also pointed out the inefficiencies with regards to the enforcement and the operationalization of the legislation in terms of proper prosecutions of offenses under the anti-gang legislation. And Mr. Vice President, having dealt with the police, their prosecution, and the length of time that the courts take to move, we must look at the end game of the prison system. And the prison system is actually for rehabilitation. And when we look at the legislation, it actually criminalizes or creates, I should say, creates new offenses, such as gang membership, coercing gangs, harboring gang members. And these offenses carry very heavy fines. Some start from 5 years imprisonment for harboring a gang member, 10 years imprisonment for concealing a gang member, 15 years for recruiting a child, 25 years for being a gang leader, and in some cases 30 years for gang members taking retaliatory action. So we see that these are the heavy fines that are actually imposed. And these offenses would also involve issues of witness intimidation and evidence tampering. So when a court sits to grant bail for offenses under this legislation, what actually happens is that the magistrate now has to weigh this accused's right to his constitutional right to bail and freedom, and also the magistrate now has to weigh the propensity of committing other offenses, also witness intimidation, witness tampering, and also the heavy fines that this legislation actually imposes. So it might be very difficult for a person to access bail if it is even granted in these circumstances. So therefore, we would now actually be increasing the prison population, because we will now have to house these accused persons. And we can actually gauge the amount of prisoners that may actually enter the system, because the Attorney General, he had provided a comprehensive breakdown of the gangs by a fact sheet dated the 29th of November 2017, where there are actually 2,484 gang members and a total of 211 gang members operating in Trinidad. And that is as of November 2017. We are now in April of 2018, so I'm sure that there would have been some increase in the amount of gang members. And the Attorney General also alluded that he knows every gang member, every gang leader name, street address, affiliation, and operation. So I know it would be very easy now for the police to actually go in and get these gang members and start prosecuting them. And when we look also at the current state of affairs of the prison, because we have to look at that also where we are going to house these prisoners, is that in the Golden Grove Aruca prison, it has a capacity to hold 655 inmates, but as of the 9th of December 2015, there are currently 1,032 inmates. And I get these figures from a prison reform public consultation held by the Office of the Attorney General on August 6th. And this actually now, Mr. Vice President, reflects the overcrowding issue at the remand prison. The prison now actually holds almost double of its capacity. And now we are going to increase the prison population by putting, let's say, over 1,000 persons inside of that prison. And this is actually a recipe for disaster. Because when we start mixing rival gangs in the prison, what is actually going to happen? Because there's no space simply to put them. And the justice system is clearly operating on two speeds, slow and stop. And there's one thing that, from the presentation by the Office of the Attorney General, that struck out to me is that, Mr. Vice President, there was an offense, a person was incarcerated for offense using obscene language. The time he spent on remand was 5 years and 6 months. 5 years and 6 months for a cuss case. And you know what's the maximum fine for this? 30 days. 30 days, Mr. Vice President. So if a simple matter like that takes 5 years and 6 months, and a trial probably takes about 10 years before it reaches the High Court, then being a gang member which is charged under an indictable offense, the time he waits for trial, he might very well be dead, Mr. Vice President. I remember when I was in another place employed at the office of the DPP, doing one matter, a file came to me, and it was a matter that the offense occurred in 1992, Mr. Vice President. I was probably about 1 year then. And 1 year old then. And I had to prosecute that matter, Mr. Vice President. So we see the deficiencies in the criminal justice system that actually occur. But when I look at all of these operational issues, what we are actually doing through this anti-gang legislation is just treating the symptoms. It's as though you go to the doctor and you just ask something for the cough, but you don't look at what is causing the cough. And when we look at the root causes of gangs, it depends on the society and the community in which those gangs operate. Those are the issues that significantly affect gang activities in this country, Mr. Vice President. And gangs, they develop as a result of a breakdown in the community and a breakdown in community values. So it is incumbent that there must be a development of better and stronger communities. There must be an increase in the social cohesion between the communities. And being also a student of criminology, we learned several terms, and one being that of collective efficacy and neighborhood legitimacy. And those notions, they really regard as cohesion amongst neighbors and their willingness to intervene on behalf of common good, on behalf of that community. And it reflects the process of activating or converting social ties among neighborhood residents in order to achieve collective goals such as public order or the control of crime. So what it actually does, what this actually says in layman language, Mr. Vice President, is that we live in a community. We must all have shared goals and shared values, so that if we see someone breaking open our neighbor house, that we call the police. We actually call the police. We just don't blank out it and say, well, no, I don't want to get involved in that because they might come for me after. We must be our brother's keeper, Mr. Vice President. And once we start to increase this, we can actually try solving the issues of gang violence and gang activity in this country. And there must be two things when we examine a community to see where a gang prosper. There are two factors we look at. We look at the structural conditions of the neighborhood and the level of social cohesion of that neighborhood. And the structural conditions would be factors such as residential stability, social problems, child abuse, victimization, and poverty. And although they say that crime should not be a political issue or that the government is not to be blamed for crime, if the government actually increases or addresses the structural conditions of these communities, such as providing jobs, providing training, increase in community activities, recreation grounds, Mr. Vice President, we can see that the youth will not now be idle and they can have some sort of activity in which that they can participate in. So the government actually has a part to play in furthering the effectiveness of any community. And that in itself would have a direct effect on the social cohesion, because once you get the community participating together, there would be now social ties and bonds being built between the members of that community. And I remember the Minister of Labour, in her contribution, would have alluded to sports in the prison and that it reduces crime. But if the minister was able to preserve the thousands of jobs that have been lost and families who are on the breadline, then that could actually be a solution, or it can actually help with the crime situation in this country. And if the Minister of Trade and Industry could bring some sort of investment in this country so that the youth can have an opportunity, then we will have all those idle hands now being used for productive activity. And if we could have the Minister of Agriculture opening up projects so that the youth can now be engaged in agriculture so that we can start feeding the nation, then in fact we can now be creating social ties in this country. And if the Minister of Foreign Affairs, CARICOM and Foreign Affairs, right, if that minister can actually send our youths abroad to study through government arrangements, then we can see a reduction in crime and youth delinquency in this country, Mr. Vice President. So the government has a big part to play when it comes to dealing with crime and criminality and youth delinquency. And we look at, there's a UNDP report, Mr. Vice President, that was done in 2012. And that report looked at the community of Laventille. And it showed what is actually happening there. And there was poverty. There was lack of employment. Businesses are fearful to actually open any business in Laventille. Public services are withdrawn, such as electricity and garbage collection.
Senator, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Vice President, you know who have been representing Laventille for the past 50 years in this country. It is the People's National Movement. And they have failed the people of Laventille. They have failed the people of Beetham. They have failed the people of Silat, Mr. Vice President. East Port of Spain, the entire East Port of Spain. And Mr. Vice President, since I have 5 minutes, I would just like to wind up some of the solutions to the problems. Under the United National Congress government, the astute leadership of Kamala Prasad Bissessa Senior Counsel, she introduced the Community Comfort Patrol, Mr. Vice President. That in itself shows that deterrence was through presence. Once the police are present in the communities, it would be some sort of deterrence for criminal activities. And I asked the government that they should reintroduce community policing into the communities, because this can actually serve as a deterrent to criminal activity. There's also a program called the GREAT program, Mr. Vice President. That's the acronym. It's actually the Gang Resistance Education and Training Program, where the law enforcement agencies engage with children in the schools. So it forms part of the curriculum so that they can actually now be away from gang violence and they would respect law enforcement agencies. And this actually builds bonds between the children and the law enforcement agencies, and this extends to the whole family at the end of the day, Mr. Vice President. There's also the Cure Violence Initiative and the Peace Promotion. And these models are similar to what happened in the ceasefire model in Chicago, Mr. Vice President. So these are all initiatives in which we can actually use so that we can reduce youth delinquency and gang violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And these are very feasible, non-expensive programs, Mr. Vice President, so that the government has no excuse when it comes to implementation and introduction of these programs. So I want to say that the anti-gang legislation, it's not the panacea for all the woes of crime, because the government had led the population to believe that when the bill was not passed in December of 2017. And if they think that this legislation is going to be the end-all, do-all of the criminal situation in this country, well, then they have news, then I have news for them, Mr. Vice President. Because the country is waiting on bated breath, because the opposition has now supported the legislation and it is going to be passed. Hopefully the independents take a similar position. But once the legislation is passed, the government has no excuse, because they said that they want the anti-gang legislation. They got the anti-gang legislation. So we hope that there's going to be a reduction in the levels of crime. And Mr. Vice President, before I close, there's a man who said something, and he said that anytime a government resorts to blaming the opposition for its failure to deliver on their mandate and their responsibility to the people, it is a clear sign that they have accepted that they have outlived their usefulness. And if the government can't deal with it, that is crime, then the government itself is part of the problem. And I want to say that the People's National Movement has outlived their usefulness in this country in the fight against crime, and they are now part of the problem. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Huggins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for allowing me this opportunity to contribute as we continue to work relentlessly to build a better Trinidad and Tobago. First and foremost, I'd just like to clear up the misinformation, Mr. Vice President, that the opposition leader would have had some epiphany or some change of heart caused by some good or superior nature. It was far from the truth, Mr. Vice President. We saw where United Party stood divided on one occasion, where some persons would have even abstained or not even be there for the vote. And I would like to put on record that it is public pressure that caused the opposition leader to bring this bill back here today. Public pressure, yeah? And we'll see that as we go along here, Mr. Vice President. This bill, Mr. Vice President, is one we see as a bill which favors life over death, a bill which favors people over politics, a bill which favors justice over injustice, and a bill which favors action over inaction. When an anti-gang bill, a bill of this nature, comes before the Parliament, a bill which is presented as, and I quote, an act to make provisions for the maintenance of public safety and order through discouraging membership of criminal gangs and the suppression of criminal activity, and for other related matters, I am duty-bound to concur with the Honorable Attorney General in saying this, Mr. Vice President, is good law. Trinidad and Tobago has a constitution which places as a duty on the state to protect, promote, and fulfill the fundamental human rights and freedoms of citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Criminal gang activity infringes on those rights and freedoms of individuals as enshrined in the Constitution, and therefore, as a responsible government, answerable to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, and having pledged to represent their interests, we are here today pressing and making every accommodation and adjustment possible, Mr. Vice President, even though at times we admittedly consider some of the opposition's recommendations questionable or unreasonable at times, but in the interest of giving our law enforcement agencies that additional means necessary to fight crime, and in particular gang-related activity, we have worked with the opposition's demands in the best interests of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, this call for anti-gang legislation is coming from all quarters of society, Mr. Vice President. All quarters. I'd like to draw to your attention one High Court judge, Justice Frank C. Prasad, has been quoted in a Newsday article on Sunday, 24th December, Christmas Eve, 2017, titled, "Judge to Politicians, Pass Anti-Gang Laws." And I quote, Justice Frank C. Prasad delivered an early morning Christmas Eve sermon in which he was asked the question of whether there is a fear in Trinidad and Tobago to pass legislation that is intended to root out criminal gangs. He said if there exists such a fear, those who harbor such know too well that judges and magistrates will jealously guard and defend the rights of citizens. He called on politicians and citizens to unite in order to stem what he describes as the barbaric operation of gang warfare in the country. He highlighted that on December 7th, the opposition in Parliament refused to support the government's proposed amended anti-gang bill. He said after much debate in the country about anti-gang legislation, it is difficult to comprehend why anyone would be fearful of legislation that is intended to tackle gang activity. Mr. Vice President, I went a little further in terms of identifying exactly what these gangs are about. And it led me to the U.S. Department of Justice's website, Mr. Vice President, where I'm seeking a further definition in terms of research that would have been done outside of Trinidad and Tobago into gangs. And it shows gangs whose members collectively identify themselves by adopting a group identity which are used to create an atmosphere of fear or intimidation. The association's purpose, in part, is to engage in criminal activity, and the association uses violence or intimidation to further its criminal objectives. its members engage in criminal activity or acts of juvenile delinquency with the intent to enhance or preserve the association's power, reputation, or economic resources. The association provides physical protection for its members from other criminals and gangs. The association seeks to exercise control over a particular location or region, where it may simply defend its perceived interests against rivals. Mr. Vice President, we are hearing about structure, power, resources, and territories. So we know that these gangs are well organized, they are well funded, they know what they're about, and as time goes by, without any relevant anti-gang legislation in place, these gangs will continue to grow and grow. And just to go a little further, Mr. Vice President, the Campbell University School of Law, 1998, in an article entitled The Constitutionality of Anti-Gang Legislation by Beth Bajagard, on page 31. So listen to this. Street gangs are thought by many to present a clear threat to public safety. As Jeffrey Myers states, gangs are routinely portrayed as an alien presence in otherwise stable communities. So in other words, in otherwise stable communities, gangs would be aliens. So you won't really see gangs in West Moorings and Valsane and so forth. Yeah? Now, gangs are now thought to be heavily armed with sophisticated array of weaponry, as Senator Jennifer Batiste-Primus was describing in her contribution. Sophisticated array of weaponry. Urban street gangs are associated with the drug trade and increase in homicides in many areas. But listen to this. Law enforcement agencies, because I heard a contribution that what more of us had stated that we have laws in place to deal with this type of activity already. But listen to this. Law enforcement agencies and courts have been largely frustrated by attempts to control the problem of gangs through the application of traditional criminal laws. As a result, state legislatures have drafted new legislation aimed specifically at addressing the problem of criminal street gangs. And it goes on to say in 1988, California became the first state to pass anti-gang legislation. Mr. Vice President, we live here in Trinidad and Tobago. There's a sworn affidavit by the Acting Commissioner of Police, which gives scientific data and research in terms of our position here in relation to gangs. 35% of all murders, according to his statement, are gang-related. 35%. And over a 3-year period from 2014 to 2017, they have identified and recorded an increase in gang membership of over 1,000 persons. 1,000 persons, and that's an increase. To date, well, 2017, the figures stand at 2,450 members. But imagine an organization growing by 1,000 persons in 3 years. Again, this bill is about action over inaction, life over death. Because as we examine the situation, we can only feel duty-bound as members here to do something about it, to take some type of action. And Mr. Vice President, that is the agenda here today. So we ask, why this bill? We believe that it is the right of every person, Mr. Vice President, to be protected from fear, intimidation, and physical harm caused by the criminal activity of violent gangs. This government is committed to supporting the fight against crime, Mr. Vice President, and the Attorney General has already successfully tabled legislation to fight various manifestations of crime, Mr. Vice President. From white-collar crime, blue-collar crime, and pretty soon, green-collar crime, crimes committed against the environment. And also in the mix, the public is calling for more legislation to fight yellow-collar crime, which would be those crimes committed on the Treasury between 2010 and 2015. So there's always also in the mix legislation to fight yellow-collar crime, Madam President. Now, if we take a look at Clause 10 of this bill, which kind of jumps out for me, we recently had a walk in Beetham Gardens and in Laventille, areas that persons would consider to be hot spots, quote unquote. I had the honor of going there with the MP, Honorable Fitzgerald Haynes. It was amazing. It was amazing to hear persons say that they want this legislation. Some of the persons that were saying they want this legislation made specific reference to the fact that they are members of criminal gangs and they wish to leave. But it's like the song Hotel California. You can enter at any time, but you can never leave. Clause 10 of this bill addresses that and gives persons some sense of hope that should they, at some point in their life, be misguided and end up in a gang and want to leave, there is some redress. And Clause 10 says a person who prevents a gang leader or gang member from leaving a gang commits an offense. This one item here, item 10, gives hope to those persons who would want to change their lives and get out of that lifestyle of crime and criminal activity. We also take a look at Clause 14 of the bill, which also stood out for me. And it spoke about recruiting. A person who recruits another person to a gang commits an offense and is liable. It goes on to name the penalties. Because, Mr. Vice President, I don't know if honorable members here are aware of how these gangs operate in communities. Because while we may see on the news all the crimes committed by these gangs, these gang members and gang leaders operate in communities and are actually very charismatic and able to lure persons into their criminal gangs. And one group in particular that I'm very concerned about because I've seen it myself is there's a phenomenon among the gang leaders in these communities where they prey on the young women and the best-looking women in the communities. And due to force and coercion, those women end up being a part of the gang, being recruited by these gang leaders. And if there's some semblance of hope in this bill, Mr. Vice President, that could prevent and discourage that from happening, I am in full support of this bill. And the woman, yes. And the woman. Listen to the opposition bench there. You would swear that they had no part at all to play in this bill. They're totally divorced from it. Because I heard Senator Hussein saying that some of these persons who are charged may die before they actually get convicted. But yet, you all are pushing for a 2.5-year sunset clause.
18 months.
But admitting that the system takes so long to actually get persons convicted.
don't need to shout across the floor. You could ask the member to give way if you have something to say, or you just have to allow him to finish his contribution.
Yes, so I see it as a bit of tongue twisting on the part of the opposition, Mr. Vice President, very respectfully. This legislation, Mr. Vice President, aims to make law enforcement agencies more effective at crime fighting, particularly in relation to gang-related activity, and providing the support that will give the families of murder victims a better chance at seeing justice for the loss of their loved ones, will give victims of robberies and assault a better chance of getting justice, and can also act as a crime prevention tool so that citizens would reduce the probability of experiencing the trauma of coming face-to-face with criminal gang activity. In closing, Mr. Vice President, I would like to assure this Honorable House that we are bringing this anti-gang bill here today not because it's a good idea, but because it has to be done. I thank you very much.
Senator Creese.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I wish to begin by commending the Attorney General for what is the second piece of legislation that focuses on stability, security of the individual, and overall security within the state. The omnibus legislation, which was recently before us, had that as its focus, and this too is a feature of this piece of legislation that's now before us. Question of security, safety, even the broader question of the security of the state as an entity in modern society against forces working against it. I remember drawing attention to the question of globalization and its impact on small societies, and the gang structures and the phenomena of gang violence is an international feature that has societies like ourselves in its grip. And I think it's the preponderance of violence that adds a particular quality to this, and of course results in a commonality of fear, the burglar-proofing syndrome that now predominates. But I think there's a tendency to place perhaps way too much emphasis on this in terms of what are the forces that are possibly disrupting our society. And I have a concern that there are other types of gang activity that is not being similarly addressed. And I often wonder when I was going through other pieces of legislation from different jurisdictions as to whether we are all sort of motovision, univision, and we are trapped in a focus that sees violence only as those acts carried out on the physical person, that sees violence only in its physical form. And I often wonder whether psychological violence and in situations of domestic abuse, the different types of violent forms are much more easily perceived. But the threats against our society, against the individuals, against the state even, has both physical and psychological aspects. Having said that, though, And I would later, in going through the detailed provisions, return to the question of the types of gangs that have been functioning in our society and whether the street gang phenomenon is the only type of gang that our legislation should be geared towards. If the notion, the driving perspective behind it is public safety and and individual security as well. I think it was Senator, I'm looking for him, he was on that side, who drew our attention to the work that was done by previous commissioner of police. Reference was made, I think, to Tony May and to Randolph Burrows, and allusion to their success. There's a tendency for hindsight to often glorify the works of mankind. And without getting into all that was involved in 1970 and its implications for gang activity and street violence, I think perhaps that is best left alone. That would require a dissertation by itself. But the maintenance of public order through discouraging membership of criminal gangs, is the stated overriding goal of this. And, we're going to cite the provisions in the Constitution which, assumes that all of us would be able to enjoy our rights as citizens, not to be disrupted by the activities, of course, as envisioned under the anti-gang legislation. What I found interesting is that there's an emphasis on the conspiracy to commit an offense. The talk of acting in concert before or after any act. And what I found interesting is that the reference to the Police Service Act and the powers that are to be granted in terms of investigative powers of all the various divisions. We're talking about the Customs and Excise Division, the Board of Inland Revenue, the Defense Force, Prison Services. And there is in this act an appreciation for the need for collaboration between various agencies of the state. And what I will be consistently arguing is that the representation of the people, ROPE as is referred to, that the Election and Boundaries Commission has a place in all of this, and I will come to it when I get to the schedule as to the link. And as to the other type of gang activity that subverts the state, that subverts the need for peace and good order and for the enjoyment, of our civil liberties. Because, again, because of the perspective on physical violence, there's a tendency to overemphasize the danger that street gangs, as one type of gang, can have, or does have, on our enjoyment of our civil liberties. The thing about the conventional approach to gang activity is that we miss the forest for the trees in a sense. For instance, there is the understanding that a police officer, prison officer even, a member of the Defense Force, SRPs, that there is need for them to take certain kinds of actions, to gather certain kinds of information, and so on. What we need to recognize is that, and I think the focus in this act is mainly on the police, when in fact there is a seamless interaction between gangs on the street and gangs in the prison. And I feel there is a deficiency in this legislation in recognizing that seamlessness and recognizing that gang activity, really the walls of the prison are mere inconvenience. Good, and that gangs exist across those parameters, those boundaries that we here recognize, but they don't. I think it is common knowledge that criminal elements operate from behind prison walls, good, and that quote-unquote hits can be put out whether or not you are at your home, wherever that is in Trinidad and Tobago, or whether you're presently incarcerated. So I think is that lack of perspective in our collective vision that makes us miss that point and miss the need for, in terms of the war on gang activity, to be sustained both by the regular policing elements, the blues and gray, as well as those policing elements who operate from behind prison walls. I'll return to that later and the need for collaboration, because crime is seamless. And not just the question of violent crime, but other forms of crime, whether white collar, I think the previous senator referred to some other colors like the yellow and so on. And we will get to that, because there are other gangs, other than street gangs, whose activities subvert the Constitution, subverts the parliamentary process, if you could remember, and even affects legislators and the aspirations of legislators as to what is passed here and how faithfully it would be implemented thereafter, in terms of what ought not to be taken for granted, even at the level of the parliament. The other thing is that the whole question of lying to law enforcement, one of the things that struck me when I read that, all the agencies who are cited, all the protective agencies cited in this legislation, that particular provision should apply, not just lying to the, to the police, but all the other officers who may, in the course of their duties, have to investigate or take action against gang-related or gang activity even. So that is something I think we need to look at again. The other thing that I had a question for, I didn't understand why it was inserted. And I quote here from Part 2. Notwithstanding subsection 2, a person who within 500 meters of a school or place of worship recruits a child to a gang commits an offense and is liable on conviction, on indictment, to imprisonment for 20 years. And the problem I had with this is why the inclusion of a place of worship. I understand the citation of the school. Why are we making it a special offense in relation to a place of worship? I'm sorry the AG is in the house, but I would have given way to the leader of government business if they would care to respond to that. But I was uncertain as to why the inclusion of a place of worship at, at this stage. Because to me, even the school doesn't necessarily have to be cited. The point is interfering, with a child is an offense of itself without having to cite the proximity to a school, but, and in this case, even a place of worship. The countervailing issue, of course, is at Part 3, the provisions for policing activity. Now that the AG has returned, I was asking the question of why both a school and a place of worship as places specifically cited as an offense for recruiting a child to a gang activity.
Thank you, Honourable Senator. Very good question, and quickly, so as not to cut your time. The reason is that there was a lot of recruitment going on in these areas, and places of worship form part of our communities. There are quite a few of them, and they are much broader than just the Catholic or Christian faith. They include, for instance, the mosques and madrasas that go on the side of it, the schools that go on the side of it. So specifically coming out of the recommendations from the TTPS, the inclusion of those areas, play fields which are associated, and the boundaries, and places of worship.
Okay, I appreciate that. I hadn't seen it in that perspective, but I read it on paper. The other concern I have at Part 3 was the question of the powers of police officers and whether there's going to be a very thin line between the excesses of policing, or whether we could have confidence in our magistracy, in our judicial system, that approaches, for instance, on the question of the extension of detention arrangements. Initially, I appreciate the 72-hour detention of a suspect, of a prospective, gang member or gang leader. But the additional 2-week period, I always felt that if liberty being so valuable, that if you are going to detain someone, it ought not to be merely on circumstantial I see or I suspect, as opposed to some or less substantial evidence. And 72 days initial detention and going back to the court without the preference of formal charges for additional 2-week period. I have a problem because you're talking now of 14/3 of 17 days detention, and that is much. That may very well be sometimes longer than a state of emergency, right? And as I say state of emergency, I remember at the end of the last one that we had, the last SOE, the number of people, if any, whose detention during the SOE led to formal charges, right? And therefore, the whole question of the power of policing that is inherent in this legislation comes under serious question, because we are here about to set up a situation where 17 days of detention could be had. And during the last SOE, it was the same police service, more or less, that exercised these powers of detention that did not lead to successful prosecutions. Matter of fact, the reverse has been the case. The state has paid out from its coffers thousands of dollars in lieu of compensation for detention. So the question is, are we now saying that the policing systems that operated during the last SOE have been refurbished, personnel reprogrammed and reoriented, that we could now formally invest them with the powers inherent in this anti-gang legislation? Because by and large, it was the same policing hierarchy that carried out all those detentions that have since proven to be questionable, that have been overturned in the law, in the courts. So how have we arrived, by what process, from that juncture to this? And I remain unconvinced that anyone thus far in our proceedings or in the other place have demonstrated that our police service has risen above the level at which it was during the last state of emergency. See, we can't divorce the two. And there has been nothing laid before this House to demonstrate such an overhaul of our policing systems that we can place that confidence in the police service. Matter of fact, the only consistent factor has been the Police Service Commission's insistence that within the present ranks, there is no one capable, up until a few months ago, of holding that top leadership position of commissioner. So what are we really saying? We are having trouble for years to name someone from within the police service as commissioner. And yet we want to invest all these powers that last were practiced during an SOE, a state of emergency. So I have a problem with that, and I would hope that in his wind-up, the AG would address that issue. The other area that I have substantial concerns is the whole question of the political dimension to all of this. Because the Section 34 episode hangs over this Parliament. And the question of whether there can be manipulation of legislation, manipulation of the legislature, manipulation of political parties, manipulation of the entire system, and whether there are gangs in our society who do that, and whether in discriminating between the gangs that we say emanate from the hills to the east and the gangs of the hills to the west, and I think it was Senator Huggins who said that there are no gangs in Valsayn, and I'm glad that he would present that evidence in a little more detail at another time. But it depends on how you define gangs and how you define violence. And if you define violence as the mere proliferation of guns and arms and ammunition, and you don't see it as other psychological forms, other political forms, in terms of domination of the society, a perversion of the Constitution, a perversion of our laws, a perversion of our systems, good, then the question as to what should be anti-gang legislation in our particular situation, and whether we are caught up in what we see on TV. And, you know, to me, that's where the issue is. So that is why I said earlier on that for me, and even under the omnibus legislation, when we were dealing again with the question of security, I said then that the Representation of the People Act should have been one of those added there. And the concerns I have about how the political system, the electoral system, could be manipulated by gangs operating with the same intent to destroy our safety, to destroy our security, could operate through that system, and the limitations then of Representation of the People Act. And I'm referring here to campaign fund financing and how that constitutes a gang-type activity in our situation with the same outcome in terms of undermining public safety, undermining individual security, because those people with those funds are able to conduct activity unreviewed, uncontrolled by provisos made by this House. So that the failure over the years to deal with campaign finance funding constitutes a serious breach in our enjoyment of our civil liberties, because we are taking it for granted. The way the Americans have recently, in 2016, took it for granted that all the funding around them, all the ads they saw were legit, that they originated out of America and not from some other place with some other intention in mind, but contrary to their laws. And in our case, it is that our laws are undeveloped in terms of dealing with the various methods and forms that campaign fund financing has an impact or is currently utilized. And in that sense, then, there may be gangs operating clearly without being in breach of our laws, because our laws have not been updated accordingly. And to the extent that this process continues, I have serious doubts as to which are the worst gangs in our society, the gangs associated with street violence and the culture of bling and so on, or the more tempered gangs operating perhaps in Valsayn, I don't know, Senator, perhaps in Glencoe, maybe Laventille, I don't know. But I think the police authorities say they have the records and the information as to where all the gangs are. I'm not sure they're including the gangs I'm thinking of, because clearly to move cocaine, not marijuana, you need millions, and you need it in US dollars. So until and unless we deal with that issue, I'm not sure that this would work. Because to the extent, and I was reading one of the offenses is to provide succor, to provide resources, finance even. And I'm wondering when we say that through CPEP, people can develop companies, not gangs now, companies, right? We've struck gangs out of the CPEP literature. Whether that arrangement, because that is one of the avenues, CPEP, URP, Special Works, that the gang-type elements of a society were accommodated, were tried to, we brought them out of street violence and street activity into more productive measures. And I always wonder whether, in fact, this provision, if you are employed in the hierarchy of CPEP or any other state agency where you are trying to provide work for people now employed and perhaps just roaming the streets, whether in fact when you give them the right to employ others and to create a company, whether you're going to be in breach of this provision in the law. Because we cannot sit here and say that all of us in this room aren't aware that over the years, whether it was Special Works, DUDE, URP, CPEP, whether it wasn't the intention of either political regimes to provide some succor, to provide some unemployment relief, and whether the funds the leaders of those companies accessed as a result wasn't used to finance other questionable activity. So there's a thin line here that we need to pay attention to. Mr. Vice President, at the end of the day, my concern has been that the concept of physical violence, which is inherent in all that's in this amendment bill, is part of our troubled history, in that we tend to focus largely on physical violence and not recognizing its other forms and how enduring the other forms of violence are and the consequences of that. And apart from, well, wanting to make that point about the representation of the People Act and the need to deal with campaign fund financing, lest gangs manipulate our politics. Also missing from this is a recognition that there are also sex rings. And in my perspective, these two are gangs. And whether this legislation, the tendency is to focus in terms of the schedule at 22, they have rape and grievous sexual assault. But I think inherent in this perspective here is not the sex rings of which I speak, as opposed to gang assault, gang sexual assault, as perverse initiation rights, but I think we have to recognize that globalization means that sex rings, child porno rings, and so on are probably part of our underground culture. And whether or not we see this as gang activity, violating our quality of life, threatening the future, of the young children, of the unborn even, right? And worthy of our attention. So that, to me, in terms of what's in the first schedule, those are my two greatest concerns. And I share with Senator Hussain a concern as to whether enough attention is being given to alternative activities that would harness the energy and the intelligence of our young people, as opposed to punitive. Yes, I would recognize that, there's a lost generation out there, and punitive, then rehabilitative strategies from behind the bars would have to be the order of the day. But I think we are still missing out on the opportunity in terms of return to the youth camp model and the creation of productive activity so as to attract the attention and the entrepreneurial possibilities of our young people. That, I think, is the greatest counter to gang activity. Finally, Vice President, I want to close by asserting, yes, at the end of the day, I probably will have no choice but to vote for this piece of legislation. But I have concerns as to inherent in it is a notion that street gangs are the biggest threat to our democracy. And nothing could be further from the truth. I thank you.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to contribute in this debate on an act to make a provision for the maintenance of public safety and order through the discouraging of membership of criminal gangs and the suppression of the criminal gang activity and for other related matters, in short referred to as the anti-gang bill. The propagation of gangs and the associated culture is one of the most critical challenges facing not only the Trinidad and Tobago community, but the international community as a whole. And as I prepared for this debate, which has been long in coming, and you can tell how important most people felt this debate was by the number of contributions we've had on this piece of legislation, which I think has been important to raise a lot of issues and bring it to the public, bring it within in the public domain. And yes, it does. And you know that I always advocate for more contributions and more conversation on the debates and on legislation in general. So I've been very happy, and I don't mind the long hours because I think it's very important. And if you look at what's been happening in the United States, in El Salvador, Jamaica, Belize, even small island states like St. Lucia, you'll understand that Trinidad and Tobago is not alone in this struggle. And as we think about what we're going to do, because as many other senators raised, this idea of how gangs impact our safety and our security and our well-being is something that has affected all of us at some point in time. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think what's been very important is that we have come together to find a solution. So before I get into the substance of my debate, I'd just like to address Senator Huggins for one moment, because I think what happened is that Senator Huggins unfortunately misread the room. There's a space for consultation. The Attorney General will address this. I am sure that the opposition has been cooperative, and we did sit at the table, and there was no kicking and screaming, and this idea of public pressure being the reason that we're here today, I think is just heavy on political rhetoric and absent of any real substance. And so that's just, it's unfortunate, I think. I think what is unfortunate is that I did note that you attempted to research the matter, and I think it would have been better had you focused on the research and convinced us as to why it was important. Because that's the space we're in today. There are days where heavy politics, and there are days when we say, okay, in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago, we're going to do this. And then we are, right? And we are. And actually, I wrote Senator Cummins, interestingly enough, you see, sorry.
Continue.
Yes, interestingly enough, and it's interesting that Senator Cummings intervened, because I assume that Senator Cummings passed his notes from his presentation to Senator Huggins, and that is because it's very similar. And that was written, that response was written for you on the last occasion. So, I mean, I'm all for note passing and sharing and consultation, but what I'm saying is that, don't misread the room, right? We're here. We're saying this is important. It's important to protect our citizens. We all agree, and we're doing the people's business, and I am happy to participate in that. All right? So now that I go back, I am not and on the Senator Huggins again, just on the sunset clause. The reason for the sunset clause is to provide, it's a mechanism within the legislation that will allow us to have further analysis after a point in time. Now, while our varying political parties disagreed on the time frame, I don't think that there was any, that we can disagree that is an important legislative check. Yes, but you all didn't disagree. The disagreement, I mean, you don't understand these things. And and as I'm on that, I want to just read a quotation here that I thought was particularly important. And it says, the Constitution itself, independence itself, represents the agreement of two political parties in our instance on the fundamental question of national unity. And that was by Dr. Eric Williams in his Independence Day speech in 1962. So I'll help you understand your party's origins, right? That while we are in an adversarial system, there are certain issues that rise above that system. And so that to come here today to say we've been dragging, kicking and screaming, that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk about solutions. And while I have my opinions on whether this anti-gang legislation falls into our short-term or long-term solutions, and what we're looking at is coming together as a parliament and actually having the population once again place their faith in us as legislators to put their best interests at heart. And throughout the length and breadth of this discussion, a number of persons have raised, which I'll get to later on, whether or not, when looking at the police service and their effectiveness and how the population feels about the police service. And I bring that up here is because the population, they also don't place a lot of faith in us as legislators, and we still have to come here and do our best. And it is not because as a whole we're ineffective, but because what they see sometimes does not give them any reason to put their trust in us. And it is the onus is on us to change that impression. On the point of this kicking and screaming, but there was a letter on January 24, 2018. The final paragraph of that letter says, the opposition remains committed to working with the government in the public interest to ensure the passage of critical legislation in the fight against crime. And as such, I repeat my request through you, Attorney General, that the government and opposition meet at the earliest opportunity to commence this process. And this was a letter from the political leader of the United National Congress to the Attorney General. It's been in the public domain, so it cannot be disputed. So that was our position. It was articulated. There was a meeting. The meeting was cordial. I was a part of the meeting, and the Attorney General can also attest that a number of recommendations came from Senator Ramdeen, who worked extremely hard on getting this. And I think these things cannot be lost in the conversation because the population wants to see more of these kinds of things and wants to see more of us working together to solve critical national issues. And to now come to cloud this debate with inaccuracies, I think it's unfair.
Total inaccuracies.
Right? And so now I just want to move to clause 15 of the bill, where it talks about giving the power to the police. And in essence, it gives a little more power to the police, which is why the sunset clause is important so that we can evaluate this. And when we're looking at what the legislation, is meant to do, it's saying that we understand that there is a problem facing society and that the criminal element has overrun the society. And so they're asking us as a parliament to now grant more powers to the police to treat with this. So you're saying there's an extraordinary circumstance and it requires extraordinary measures. And that's why you need this 3/5 majority so that we can approve these extraordinary measures. However, critical to that would be trust in the police service and and how we feel about the police service, how the population feels about the police service, and probably indeed how the police service feels about itself. And, in a speech at the opening of the Besson Street police station, the Prime Minister raised a point referring to the TTPS and any civilian desirous of serving the country, that when we give people the opportunity to wear the uniform, and if they fall short or engage in criminal conduct, they have no right to be in the police service. So let them go and mix cement somewhere, but they cannot wear the uniform and be a criminal. And you've heard these types of discussion all over, and then you hear people talking about the criminal element in the police service, etc., etc. But I've not heard anything about what we're doing as a system to weed out the criminal elements. So here we are saying, yes, we all agree, give the police more power in an extraordinary circumstance, but we're not saying what we're doing to fix the problem of corruption in the police service. And there are ways to carry out a conversation that is constructive and that we can address things like corruption without it being clouded in what seems like an attack on an entire service. And I think we have to just be very careful, because in my personal experience with the police service has been nothing but positive. And that's, you know, I think my personal experience, but it might not have been the experience of all of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So we do have to be very careful with how we construct the conversation in the light of us saying, yes, we can give them more power, because you can't on one hand say that's okay, but some of them might be criminals. It's giving mixed signals. And you know, I just also would like to quote from an article on August 21st, 2013, where, as an opposition senator, Faris Alwari, our current Attorney General, said that for the anti-gang legislation or anti-gang to be useful, the government must ensure that the police are capable of gathering sufficient and reliable evidence. And this must be done through established units, properly funded, managed, and through thorough resources provided by the government. Now, I use that quote because I agree with this wholeheartedly. And in preparing for this debate, I did quite a lot of academic research, but I did a lot of reaching out to people who work in the units, who live this day to day, to kind of find out, well, what's missing? What are we, when we sit in this room, missing to make this more effective and to make it more useful? And in those conversations, you know, I was told that, yes, we do have the anti-gang unit, the OCIU, they've merged, but what have we done to ensure that they're properly resourced and properly financed? Because my information is that that's not the case. So when you're talking evidence gathering, etc., when you're talking giving the police or arming them with this piece of legislation, in the absence of all the other measures required to make this successful, it almost feels like we're setting them up to take the blame, right? So that you give them the legislation, but if they can't do anything with it because they aren't properly resourced, then I don't know that we're going to get the end that we seek. And so I looked at the Department of Justice and law enforcement and what they recommended for an effective anti-gang or police unit, a gang police unit. And they said in order to be effective against these extremely dangerous groups, you have to be able to properly collect intelligence and intelligence gathering. So you have to monitor gang activities, develop intelligence assets that reveal gang objective and resource plans, investigate gang-related crimes and apprehend perpetrators, work with varying departments, so the same kind of cohesion that Senator Hussein spoke about. And all of these things, when you're talking about surveillance and how you execute what the law would allow you to do, you know, the OCI, you've been asking for something as simple as binoculars, night vision binoculars to collect, to gather evidence, right? They don't have that. I think at some point in time they say, you know, if you'd like it, you could see if you could purchase it on your own, because it would make them more effective. When you look at the there's not been any proper implementation of the cleaning of the firearms, so that sometimes when they go in to check out the firearms, they're rusty and all these. And these are little things that can be fixed to make us better and help us to achieve our objectives. And I think it's something that we have to be thinking about. In an article in the Sunday Guardian of the 28th of January 2018, ACP Anthony James spoke at length about the high murder rates and the low detection. And I would just like the opportunity to quote some of the things that he said, because I think it's important that when we are saying, look, we're giving the police what they asked for, this is not all that they've asked for. They've asked for a lot more, right? So ACP James said with time, the right equipment, legislative backing, and public support, and the public supporting them, the murder toll will be significantly reduced. He said that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service needs to up their game, so there's a recognition that there is room for improvement, but then how do we help them improve? He said that this will come with proper training and equipment, married with the laws, and support for law enforcement, and of course, time. And so this brings me to this question of training for police officers or training within the police service. You oftentimes find that the persons who are sent on training are senior officers. Senior officers who may not have that much time to utilize the training within the service because they may be closer to retirement. And I think if we're going to do this thing in a logical manner, you train the younger ones, because we're spending money, right? So we should prioritize and spend it wisely. And therefore, you train those who are younger so that we can have more use out of the training. There's another suggestion that I'd like to make here. Well, as I've said before, my tertiary education was in the United States, and there's a financial aid program to allow students who cannot afford to go to school on their own access federal financial aid. So government funding the education. So if we were to take a look at how as we're looking at overhauling gates and all of these other things, if you are accessing government funding so that you're requesting government funding, you can find ways to pay back the government funding. So one of the ways the New York State does it is that you can access financial aid, do degrees in criminology, criminal justice, forensic science, etc., and all these things that the police service need to improve and to be modern and more effective. So any area, even foreign languages, etc., you can pursue a degree in an area that can help. And then when you enroll within the police service training academy and you complete your training, each year that you work, they minus money from the money that you owe to the federal aid department. And this has been effective in terms of recruiting the kinds of candidates you want, and having the police service be reflective of what you would like to see. It's also attracting different people within the service. And I think it's something that we may want to consider as we are looking at not just anti-gang legislation specifically, but crime on the whole and how we treat with it. ACP James also noted that there are currently over 200 police officers attached to the Homicide Bureau in Port of Spain, Aruca, San Fernando, and Tobago, and that the ideal figure would be somewhere around 400, which is twice what they have now. And so you've also had there's also this situation occurring within the TTPS where while we have a total strength within the thousands, are we placing people in the units and in the areas that we need them? So are we, again, doing this in an effective and thoughtful manner? And this has not been the case. You also have persons who would have gone on training for specialized units, come back, and because of your rank, you are now in a unit that has nothing to do with the training that the government paid for. And you are not effective. So again, this does not have to be, it is a complicated problem, but this does not have to be an overly cumbersome and complicated thing that we have to deal with. We just have to be smart about the way that we do things. See, and ACP James said to attract the right individuals with the proper acumen. We have to, once you do that, then you will find a difference in the way the police service interacts with the public, and then you build that trust differently. And so you can have the treatment of witnesses and suspects and being able to get things like confessions and, well, the assistance that they need. It's also looking at how you develop the interpersonal skills of the police officer and the total development of the officers that we have on the ground. And that so we may have people who are extremely so we aren't placing people in the spaces that we need them. So if you don't have the interpersonal skills to deal with witnesses, just because you are there you probably should not be in that position at that point in time. And so again, I think there's a smart way to do things, and we've instead found more complicated ways of doing it. He noted that the officers have been faced with many hurdles over the years as they try to solve murders, the major one being the unwillingness of witnesses to come forward and major gaps in the witness protection program, or popularly known as Witnesses is Dead. And I think Senator Ramdeen made some extremely important points on why we need to improve the witness protection program. And we also need to look at things like plea bargaining and how we introduce these things into the system to make it more effective. We have as well, he said many cases in the past has collapsed as a result of witnesses who recant their statements, and he wants some legislative support that compels or punishes witnesses who switch on their sworn statement. And he admitted that while the country is going on a snail's pace to shift from eyewitness evidence to science-based policing, the necessary, and again, the problems of equipment and training are inching their way into the service. And police officers need to learn new techniques and must be equipped with modern technology. See, this is another thing that I always find to be a little, disheartening. When you go into the police station, they take out this massive station diary and flip through, and you're writing everything down. And it is 2018. I think we can find ways to move away from that system where you have handwriting everything into the station diary, and if the station diary goes missing, well, yes. So, yeah, and if you can't understand what I write or what somebody else writes down in the diary, again, there's no reason for us to be living like that right now. I think he said it about 7 times within this one article that training and technology and moving the TTPS forward is important. And I say, when we say things like, I believe, yes, this editorial from the Saturday Express on the 24th of March, it ended with, the long-heralded war on crime has been given a tremendous boost. The men and the women of TTPS must make good on their tacit promise to deliver the results commensurate with the expectations they themselves have created. So we are now creating a space where we've given the impression that this is going to yield very quick results and turnover. And I think we have to be very careful with that, because when we pass this legislation, which we will, it's not going to be massive lockups and all of a sudden there's an end to gang violence. But by creating this kind of public imaging that you need the anti-gang, you need the anti-gang, you need the anti-gang, and that will stop the crime and it will bring peace, it's just really setting ourselves up for failure, I think. And we have to just be careful with the way we frame things. There's another article in a St. Vincent and the Grenadines newspaper that was titled Gangs Rule Trinidad and Tobago. And they were talking about...
Newspaper, Senator?
Pardon me?
Name of the newspaper.
The name of the newspaper. No, I don't, but can I list it after? Thank you. Yes. And, you know, it was looking at the pervasiveness of gang culture and the increasing amount of violence. And I don't know, like, as you hear about the types of crimes being committed, people being beheaded, and you find in parts of bodies, you know, in different places, it has really said to us that the brutality of the gang activity within our country cannot be ignored. And what I thought was interesting in that article is that they noted that the growth of the gangs within Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica has been so ubiquitous that they almost represent a challenge to state sovereignty. And I think this is what Senator Creese was talking about, where gangs and gang members have become so empowered, and this idea of different types of gangs that they've grown so powerful that they can almost be seen as a challenge to state sovereignty. And you see things like that when you see gang member arrested or alleged gang member arrested, and an entire community erupts into violence. The nation is now at a standstill and held at the mercy of one group of persons. The police and the defense force and whatever joint army patrol, they stand, you know, almost just trying to contain the situation, but they can't end it. And so that's when they say it represents a challenge to state sovereignty, we see it almost every time someone is arrested and they don't, and the community just doesn't like it. And then how are we treating with these things? You know, I hear the comments sometimes about, you know, we should get a bus and load everybody in, and that's not, in my respectful view, the solution that we are looking for. But what we can admit is that the phenomenon has had a very dangerous effect on surrounding communities and on the areas. That the gangs are so integrated within the community that if you go in to try to arrest one person, chaos ensues. So now we have the anti-gang legislation, and you go in to give effect to the legislation. How are we prepared to now treat with the backlash of arresting persons who are seen as, well, dons within their community, or the providers within their communities? Are we prepared to do that? Are we prepared for that? I mean, again, in terms of equipment, the provision of shields and helmets, riot gear, within the police service, I think GB has them, but they aren't the first responders in situations like this. So that the members of the TTPS, or say in Bessel Street, etc., they don't have access to this equipment. So you have a time gap waiting to respond to this situation. So again, when you're putting the legislation in place, assuming that you want it to be effective and work the way that you intend it to work, then I give the police the equipment that they would need to do the job properly. And so as we're looking at how we can, as I was preparing again within the research, the training and equipment of the police service was one important part. And then another part was, okay, well, once it works, and if it works effectively and people are arrested, they have to go to prison. Is our prison system equipped for if this legislation works? And with the numbers that we've seen bandied about in terms of what the gang membership looks like, what the exponential increase has been over the years, what we can expect the increase to be over the next few years, are we now equipped to deal with those persons being arrested? And so to understand how it works, you know, I looked at the El Salvador system, because they also had put anti-gang legislation in place, and there's been some discussion to and fro whether or not it has been effective, but it has led to more arrest. And it is one of the countries with the highest gang membership, including places like Los Angeles, etc. But the insight Crime.org had an article, El Salvador Violence Rising Despite Extraordinary Anti-Gang Measures, published on October 3, 2017. And it noted that in September, El Salvador saw 435 homicides, almost 15 per day, making it the country's most violent month in 2017, according to official figures. The climbing number of murders in El Salvador contradicts the government's narrative about the supposed success of its tough talk and heavy-handed actions against gangs. Not only has the number of homicides begun to rise again after sustained declines, but statistics also cast doubt whether or not the administration is changing the effectiveness. And so the question is, as you look at all the tough talk and the conversation around things like legislation and legislative approaches, will we have just a quick turnaround, or will it be a sustained impact on the pervasive problem that we face? And so seeing that despite having more arrests and the murder rate starting to climb back up, the government of El Salvador focused their efforts on the prison system in an attempt to disrupt imprisoned gang leaders' use of cell phones and other means of communication, and to direct and coordinate extortions, murders, and other crimes on the outside. And I thought that was an important example for Trinidad, because if you are familiar with our social media landscape, you see videos from the prison system, from the prisons almost on a daily basis. And we've had the cause to ask the question over and over, are the jammers and jammers, are they working? And every day, every time we ask the question, we're given the same response. They're there, yes, they're working. And then, so now you have to question your own sanity, because if it's working, how are these videos being placed on social media? Exactly. So not only are they able to record, but they're able to upload, and they also are not afraid of any consequence of their action, so that the video is up there, your face is out there, and we're already in prison. So we got locked here, right? And so what happens after, again, assuming the effectiveness of this legislation, persons being arrested, what happens after? We do have a prison system that is currently ineffective. And I know that a considerable amount of time and resources have been placed on public consultations on prison reform, but the numbers don't lie. In the remand yard prison, there's a 157% overpopulation. In Port of Spain, it's 290, so while we face overpopulation currently without this law within the prison system, it's also simultaneously understaffed. And so are we, by trying to solve one problem, creating an even bigger problem on another end? And so I'm saying, once persons are detained under Clause 16 of this legislation, I don't assume that they will be detained in the police station, so they will become part of this already overpopulated prison system. And again, with the nature of gangs and the way that they work, you put all of them in these small rooms with nothing else to do. I mean, I think that we may find ourselves, and at a cost of $13,271.41 per person, are we thinking again about what happens after the legislation is put in place, assuming that it is effective? Because I think a number of prisons made an assumption that it will not be effective. So I'm saying, even if it is effective, we are also now facing another problem. And I think that it's important that the government considers the reality of our prison system, what we're seeing, and look at it not from the position of political expedience, but are we really equipped to handle this legislation being very effective? And Mr. Vice President, and like the rest of Trinidad and Tobago, want gang violence to stop in Trinidad and Tobago. It's been around for many years, but it has gotten worse. And I think Senator Small raised it in his contribution. Are we taking a look at society as a whole and wondering what we have done to create this inequity or inequitable distribution where some persons are really completely left out and cut off from our development? So while Trinidad and Tobago might have numbers, statistics in terms of education and how many persons are tertiary educated, and we may look good on paper, if you live here, the reality is some.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes. Do you intend to?
You want me?
utilize
Yeah,
the
I can
full 5?
conclude before the lunch break. Yeah. And so, again, we do need if we want this legislation, we would like the legislation to be successful. But for it to be successful, we have to take a very careful look at our society and figure out the causes of the problems. And because we are the anti-gang legislation is at the end of the road, and we need to kind of look at the beginning and what preventative measures. And I think a lot of persons have discussed that, but I would just like to place on record my endorsement for looking in totality at the gang problem and finding real solutions, because this is just a stop gap. It's not a solution to our problem. And in closing, I'd just like to say that what we experienced within this anti-gang legislation, within the debate around the anti-gang legislation, like I said on the onset, was an approach where both political parties said, look, this is a problem, we do have to deal with it. And however long it took us to get here, we're here now, and that's important. And I think it also showed, what it showed us is how important leadership is. And having a leader that says, this is the work that needs to be done, this is the committee, meet with us, we'll help you draft the legislation, and here we are today. Leadership is about action and acting on behalf of the country. And what we've seen from the opposition leader and members of the opposition bench has been, I think, what the nation would like to see as a whole. I thank you.
Honourable members, it is now 1 o'clock and time for the lunch break. This House will now stand suspended for 1 hour. We will return at 2 p.m.